For centuries, it was unimaginable that a tiny island could build an empire on which the sun never set. Yet through ambition and industry, Britain did just that. Battles were fought across continents, and treaties were signed in distant lands. This is the story of how the British Empire took over the world. Britain, an island nation on the edge of Europe, once cast its gaze across oceans like a restless wanderer seeking its place in an unfolding world of empires. The age of discovery had seen Spain and Portugal carve out vast overseas empires, amassing untold wealth. In 1497, John Cabot had sailed westward and claimed land in Newfoundland for England. But for decades, England held no colonies. After the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, England established naval supremacy. English sea captains, the sea dogs like Francis Drake, soon plundered Spanish treasure ships. Shipwrights and navigators realized that England might follow the path of empire. The dream of empire was still young and in bloom, as English leaders began to imagine vast dominions like those of Portugal and Spain. Under Queen Elizabeth I, England took tentative steps onto the world stage. In 1600, she granted a royal charter to the newly founded East India Company, ceding England's future dominion in India. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, merchants and settlers looked to the New World. In 1607, Jamestown in Virginia became the first permanent English settlement there. In 1620, Puritans established Plymouth Colony in New England, seeking religious freedom. Within decades, dozens of English colonies dotted the Americas, from Newfoundland and New England in the north, through the Chesapeake and Carolinas, down to the Caribbean islands. These coastal communities shared a common language and allegiance to the crown. In English ports, tobacco, indigo, cotton, and sugar from the colonies fueled burgeoning industries. In London, Bristol, and Liverpool, merchants counted their fortunes. Each ship that arrived with colonial goods made imperial ambition seem more plausible. By the mid-17th century, British ambitions had surged. The English Parliament passed the Navigation Acts in 1651, legally binding colonial trade to English ships. The Royal Navy became guardian of these far-flung sea routes. In 1655, Oliver Cromwell's forces seized Jamaica from Spain, adding another sugar-rich island to Britain's name. English planters on Jamaica imported thousands of African slaves to work the plantations, forcing the labor that would produce wealth for Britain. Meanwhile, Britain established its first enduring foothold on the African coast. In 1661, an English governor landed on the Gambia River and founded a fort at what is now James Island, aiming to trade gold and slaves. By treaty, in 1664, the Dutch in North America quietly handed over New Amsterdam, soon renamed New York, to England. Now England's colonies stretched from New England and Virginia down to Barbados and Jamaica, along with trading forts in Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Britain's merchant navy grew fat on this commerce. Its ships and officers patrolled every ocean, enforcing the emerging British maritime empire. By the mid-1700s, Britain was locked in a global contest. Its empire had rivals. France, Spain, the Dutch, and others vied for global markets and colonies. In India, the East India Company's private armies were poised for conquest. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, Robert Clive and company forces defeated the Nawab of Bengal, seizing enormous wealth and making Britain the de facto master of India's richest province. Across the Atlantic, Britain went to war with France in North America and the Caribbean. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, played out on multiple continents. British troops marched through Canadian forests and captured the key fortress of Quebec in 1759, effectively ending France's rule in eastern North America. Caribbean islands changed hands in naval fights. When the smoke cleared in 1763, the Treaty of Paris redrew the world map. France renounced nearly all of its mainland territories and its Indian conquests to Britain. Spain ceded Florida. The British flag now flew over Canada, Florida, and key Caribbean islands, as well as a large share of India. Britain stood undefeated on multiple continents, richer and more powerful than ever before. Then came setbacks and changes. In 1775, the 13 American colonies in the East erupted in rebellion. The Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, pitched Britain against its own American subjects. British generals fought from Lexington to Saratoga, but in 1781, at Yorktown, the British were forced to surrender. In 1783, Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States, a stunning blow to imperial pride. The loss of the 13 colonies was dramatic, but British imperial energy endured. Loyalists and other Crown supporters left the new United States and helped strengthen British North America, Canada. Britain looked elsewhere to expand. In 1788, a fleet of convict ships under Captain Philip Shallou established a new colony at Port Jackson, Sydney Cove, in New South Wales, the other side of the globe, but another addition to empire. As the Union Jack was raised over Australia, Britain was planting the seeds of a Pacific empire. In the decades after 1788, Britain extended its reach on every continent. New settlements spread across Australia. New Zealand, formerly annexed in 1840, became part of the empire. In Asia, Britain seized further territory. It took Malacca from the Dutch, occupied Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and expanded in India by fighting regional powers like the Marathas and Sikhs. By the mid-19th century, Britain controlled or influenced lands across Asia, from India to the Malay states to Singapore and Hong Kong, and also held more of the African coastline. British dominions and protectorates now span from the Red Sea, Egypt, occupied 1882, to the Cape of Good Hope, and from Canada in North America to New Zealand in the Pacific. The map of empire by 1850 was almost covered in a red hue. The 19th century saw Britain's reach expand to its greatest extent. The Royal Navy, unchallenged at sea, conquered rival colonies during the Napoleonic Wars, 1705 to 1715. Britain's victories at Trafalgar in 1705 and Waterloo in 1715 smashed France's ambitions. When the peace treaties were signed, Britain collected vast spoils. France surrendered Malta, Mauritius, and many Caribbean islands. The Dutch handed over Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and the Cape Colony. Spain relinquished Trinidad and Minorca. Britain also acquired a foothold in West Africa, Heligoland from Denmark. By one measure, between 1815 and 1914, Britain added nearly 10 million square miles and some 400 million people to its empire. The world was awash in Pax Britannica, an era of relative peace maintained by British naval and industrial power. At the heart of this imperial world was India, the jewel in the crown. In 1857, a large-scale revolt of Indian troops and civilians against company rule, the Sepoy Mutiny, shook Britain. It was crushed, and Parliament abolished the East India Company. Britain assumed direct rule. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876. British governors, supported by loyal Indian soldiers, now administered a vast population of hundreds of millions. They built roads and railway lines that stretched thousands of miles. A steam engine could travel from Bombay to Calcutta through British territory. Telegraph poles ran across plains and jungles, giving near-instant communication between India and London. English-language schools educated a new class of Indians in Western science and law. These measures modernized parts of India and tied it economically to Britain. Indian cotton, tea, opium, and spices poured out to the empire, but there was also resentment. High taxes and unfair land policies sparked famines and protests. By the 1880s, Indians began to organize. The Indian National Congress was founded in 1885 to press for Indian rights. In time, leaders like Gandhi would demand full independence from the British Crown. Across Asia and the Pacific, Britain's reach continued to grow. It had interests everywhere. In China, trade disputes led to the Opium Wars, 39 to 42 and 1856 to 60. Britain's victory forced China to cede Hong Kong Island to Britain and open its ports. In 1860, Hong Kong's Kowloon Peninsula was also acquired. Britain took Aden, Yemen, in 1839 to protect its Red Sea route to India and acquired strategic islands from the Mediterranean like Cyprus to the Atlantic like Gibraltar. In Africa, after 1880, British claims ballooned. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain controlled Egypt and Sudan in the northeast, held the Cape Colony and the Boer republics in the south, eventually forming the Union of South Africa in 1910, and carved out Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Ghana, and others. The 1884 to 85 Berlin Conference saw European powers divide Africa. Britain emerged with a line of territory from Cairo to Cape Town. Almost half of Africa's coastline was in British hands.
By 1914, the British Empire was at its zenith. Over a quarter of the world's land area and population, roughly 412 million people, lived under the Union Jack. When World War I broke out, Britain and its empire were one of the chief Allied powers. Troops from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the British West Indies fought across Europe, in the Middle East, and in Africa. The Royal Navy enforced a global blockade against Germany. British soldiers marched in French trenches and in the Sinai Desert. British wings of the nascent Royal Air Force fought over Mesopotamia. The war was won in 1918, but at enormous cost. More than 1 million British Empire soldiers killed, economies strained, and a general sense that the old world order had been broken. Britain even gained new mandates, like Palestine and Iraq, from the defeated Ottoman Empire. Yet as European empires imposed new borders in the Middle East, nationalist sentiments grew back home. By 1919, figures like Mahatma Gandhi, recently returned from South Africa, were leading mass movements for self-rule in India, and the Republic of Ireland was demanding a break from Westminster. Between the world wars, Britain tried to adapt. The 1920s saw the empire rebranded. It was formally called the British Commonwealth of Nations, and the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, were recognized as equal members alongside Britain. The Statute of Westminster, 1931, gave them full autonomy. India, however, remained a colony, and its struggle intensified. Gandhi's Salt March of 1930 and mass protests won global sympathy. At the same time, the Great Depression of the 1930s hurt both British and colonial economies. Unemployment and poverty spread in India and West Africa, feeding discontent. Britain built a few new roads and schools across the empire to quiet unrest, but the idea of self-government was in the air. Then World War II arrived, and once again the empire was tested. Britain stood almost alone against Nazi Germany in 1940-41, rallying under Churchill's leadership. The Blitz of London showed the home front's determination. Troops and warplanes from across the empire, Indian and African infantry, Royal Australian Air Force pilots, Canadian tank brigades fought on multiple fronts. But the war in Asia was devastating. In early 1942, Japanese armies overran much of Britain's Asian empire. Singapore fell to the Japanese in February 1942, the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. Burma became a bloody jungle campaign. By 1945, Britain and its allies emerged victorious, but Britain was exhausted. The economy was in ruins. The old imperial currency was spent. The dismantling of the empire accelerated after 1945. In 1947, Britain granted independence to the two new nations of India and Pakistan. On 15 August 1947, the British Raj, the empire's most prized possession, ended, and two independent countries arose amid jubilation and tragedy. Almost immediately, other colonies began to go free. In 1948, Britain granted independence to Burma, Myanmar, and Ceylon, Sri Lanka. In the early 1950s, a string of African colonies achieved freedom. Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, in 1957 was the first sub-Saharan colony to break free, followed by Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, and more. Malaya and Singapore gained self-government in 1957 and 1965. By the late 1960s, most of Britain's colonies in Africa and Asia had become independent states. Hong Kong remained a British Crown colony until 1997, and Britain clung to a few small islands, Falklands, Gibraltar, etc. But the empire, in essence, had vanished. The handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997 is often noted as the symbolic end of empire. In the final analysis, Britain's empire was built on industry and the navy. A powerful merchant fleet and navy enforced trade from the North Atlantic to the South China Sea. British-made goods, cotton cloth, machine tools, guns were sold across the globe, while colonial ports and railways supplied raw materials to British mills. The Industrial Revolution gave Britain unmatched economic power, which fueled expansion. And British ideas traveled too. English became a global language, and Westminster-style governments and the rule of law took root in many colonies. The legacy is immense. Former British colonies often share legal systems, educational standards, and sports, cricket, football, introduced during colonial times. The Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of 56 countries, remains as a relic of empire and a forum for cooperation. Yet history also remembers the costs. The rise of the British Empire involved wars and suffering. Colonial soldiers died in conflicts from the Zulu War in Africa to the trenches of World War I. Local rebellions were crushed, from India's 1857 uprising to the Mau Mau Revolt in Kenya, 1952–60. And the British Empire profited from the Atlantic slave trade for centuries before abolishing it. Parliament ended the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, but the human and moral toll had been profound. Famines like those in Bengal under colonial rule and cultural disruption also marked the colonial era. Today, scholars and citizens debate this heritage. Monuments and textbooks in Britain and former colonies often revisit the empire's actions with fresh eyes. There is pride in technological and administrative achievements, but also guilt over exploitation and racism. The imperial story is thus a complex one, woven into the histories of many nations. Now, as our narration draws to a close, we look at the modern map. The age of British imperial rule has ended, but its echoes remain. Political borders around the world still reflect decisions made in London and Berlin a century ago. The English language and British legal concepts are woven into the fabric of countries from Canada to India to Australia. Even symbols like flags and anthems bear Britain's imprint. In many ways, the shape of today's world, from the United Nations to the global economy, is built on foundations laid during Britain's imperial century. But the story also shows that great power can fade. By mid-20th century, the British Empire had given way to a world of independent nations, united by history and in many ways by the institutions left behind.